welcome back to another video. In this video, I'll be discussing a previous video that I've just shared on my Facebook page, which is of French historians, which recently, within the last 3 months, have released their version of what is the Count of Monte Cristo. Now, as these French historians, we might find a French, you could say, propaganda behind said reporting. Because in said story of their connectedness to a writer known as Pichet, whom they specifically, as French historians say, a black man could not have written such a tale. Only a white man could have written such a tale. And in this particular notion, we find once again the injustice that which Thomas Alexandre Dumas was fighting. Now, in said video, they also talk about how said character, upon becoming the Count of Monte Cristo, became as an aloot. Which, now imagine an aloot of a person of color, known as a mulat. And in this particular statement, you might find a falseness behind these French historians. If they were true historians of said Alexandre Dumas, they would be able to place where his father stems from. Now, who is Alexandre Dumas' father? Well, you would find that Thomas Alexandre Dumas is the father. And where might his story be told? Now, in the understanding as spoken by the French historians, this particular tale known as The Diamond and the Vengeance had to be approved by Napoleon, as reported within their said statement. Which means that even Napoleon had a chance to overglance and put his particular word into such story, which would alter the rest of French history. The moment that France no longer recognized through their propaganda a person of color being able to be a person of education, to be able to be a person of a monarchy and a clergy. And the moment we saw that Napoleon essentially drove the stake of this particular legislation, well, one might find why there was essentially a burial of Thomas Alexandre Dumas. He was wiped out from history because he was the heir to the throne of France as a colored man, as a mulat. And in this particular notion, we might find a re-analysis of falseness within these French historians, whom themselves are most likely paid by the French government in order to put a separate notion behind the true Count, Thomas Alexandre Dumas. When looking at the particular story of the Count of Monte Cristo, does that story sound of a man as described by Pichet? And in that particular notion, if this man was as described as Pico, whom then became Alout before becoming the Count of Monte Cristo. Pico is also another name for spicy. And as a mix individual, you might find a particular spice to said individual. In the rewritings of Napoleon Bonaparte of said historian's analysis, we might find that there are still hints within said writing pointing once again to Thomas Alexandre Dumas. It is simply the corruptness of these historians, which if you can be paid a certain amount of money, all of a sudden you might find you don't have a problem altering history anymore. And so, whom was the true Count of Monte Cristo? And was Alexandre Dumas, a man of color, simply just a ripoff off of a white author, discrediting all of his fictional novels to be known as ripoffs all of a sudden within said French libraries? And yet, as these historians specifically speak of a spicy individual, a mulat of sorts, who might this mulat individual have been? This Pico. Well, one might find that Thomas Alexandre Dumas was the particular story as depicted within said history. And these French historians are butchering said stationary knowledge, which is deeply rooted in French culture. And the moment we erase this from French culture, we might as well rewrite all of history according to whatever we want to say without basing it on factual evidence. What is the purpose of history? It is meant to give a point of reference so that you may see where we are now today. And if the history is of a false reference, we might see that there is a falseness today. Now, I don't speak of this particular tale to specifically sit here and say, I should be King of France. That is not my goal behind this. But in the particular notion regarding my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, why might the French government be lying regarding a man of color, specifically being the king? Well, we might find a racial identity, a racial superiorness, which already coming from a Swiss warlord such as Napoleon, whom had just finished fighting off the Swiss, or specifically Bonaparte, as I've come to realize in my own particular analysis of what Napoleon truly means. Every reference in letters or texts referring to the heroic feats of Napoleon are actually speaking of the nappy-headed lion, the Napoleon, also referring to Thomas Alexandre Dumas, whom was a man of color with nappy hair. And yet in his powerful stance, even in the Gospel of Thomas, it is written, when the man is consumed by a lion, he is blessed. As blessed as the man that now becomes the lion. Cursed is the man that is consumed by the lion. Cursed is the man that then becomes the lion. In the understanding of Lion, Napoleon, stemming from the word lion in Spanish, where might we find the Napoleon? Specifically in Thomas Alexandre Dumas, whom was meant to be the true emperor. Now, the only reason I share this is specifically to heal said lineage. Because of this story has repeated itself time and time and time again within my family's history. And in understanding this particular story, we once again arise to the notion that the white man does not want the story told. The story of a man of mulat color, half white and half black. As this man could not possibly be allowed to rule over a kingdom such as France. In the Count of Monte Cristo, it is spoken of said man having tremendous wealth. Such a man as Thomas Alexandre Dumas, being the son of Antoine de la Poyeterre, we would find he is the son of the owner of the largest slave plantation of all Europe in Saint-Domingue, Haiti. And this largest slave plantation, which harvested coffee beans and sugar, we might find here that Antoine de la Poyeterre took on a slave to become his property as a sexual object. Marie-Louise Dumas, or specifically Marie Cécette Dumas. And from this particular woman, she gives birth to a son, Thomas Alexandre de la Poyeterre, son of the Baron, whom is next in line to the throne of France. He is King Louis's brother, whom is sent elsewhere in order to prevent the rivalry in between brothers over said throne. A similar story, if you wish, to the Man in the Iron Mask, King Louis and King Philippe, whom in the idea of creating a switch creates a revolution. Was Thomas Alexandre Dumas the fiction regarding his stories, written by his son, Alexandre Dumas, were they truly fictional, as they want us to believe now, was actually of a theft of work? Was it truly a theft of work to write about the greatness of his father, a man of color, that even during a time when, just as it always has been, for a man of color to achieve something for himself, and once again, even French historians are now preaching a deferring of said story. They're discrediting said story, and yet it is rooted in French factual history. And so who do we believe more? The true factual history, or these corrupt French historians? In understanding Alexandre Dumas' work, he might also write a novel such as Robin Hood, after his father himself was called Mr. Humanity. As the lineage of the Dumas progressed, so did the stories. And within said lineage, we also found that even some of the French kingdom still remember the name Alexander. Le Grand Alex. Qui était le Grand Alex? Thomas Alexandre would become to be called Alex. Who would have been this great Alexander? And was history rewritten specifically to veer away from this great man? In history, it is said that Napoleon based his actions on following the footsteps of Alexander the Great. And in the rivalry of said Napoleon, in his obsessiveness for being a short man of stature compared to what would have been a mulat with an equal and greater force to the throne, might we see that Bonaparte specifically sabotaged said man as Alexandre Dumas, that which would become the story of the Kingdom of France. In the rewriting portion of said history, we might find clues pointing to the true heir of said throne. And within the coverage and propaganda placed by Bonaparte, we see France take on a different trajectory going forward. And this said trajectory still remains rooted in this present day, because even to this day, the Macronists and the Communists specifically try to hide a man of color that was meant to be the king of France, the mulat, Thomas Alexandre Dumas. In terms of the cost that this particular story has had, well, let's take a look in the analysis of the French kingdom, shall we? In this modern day and age, once again, the archetype represents itself. And within said day and age, France is under revolution once again. And in this day and age, said heir is locked away in a foreign land, offshore. Where might we see said story replicate itself? In the keeping of said individual from realizing their full potential. And within said story, we find that Edmond Dantes, also known as Thomas Alexandre Dumas, was not imprisoned for the said 12 years, such as Edmond Dantes. You see, if you were to look at the story itself, you would find that this imprisonment is still present on this day. And this story was written over 200 years ago. Because that is how long the imprisonment of the Dumas has lasted. As a result of being people originating from color, the Dumas have been punished throughout the eras of France, beyond Thomas Alexandre Dumas. And going forward into this present day and age, might we see the liberation of Edmond Dantes from Dante's Inferno, from this hell? And might we see a salvation, a rebirth from said suffering? That is entirely up to the reader at this particular point. And as a viewer, you can actively vote on said subject. The more a issue is brought up, the more one might find it needs to be addressed. And in understanding the lie that has been given for my family to continue to live as a result of being descendants of a person of color. I might argue now, as a partial person of color, based around the suffering that people of full color may experience. Even I myself, as a partial person of color, still receive judgment based on being of said color. And so, is this systemical racism, which was present, keeping and reinstating said slavery within the Isle of Saint-Domingue, and said story of Thomas Alexandre Dumas? Might we find a similar level of racism within said French kingdom, keeping said heir from ascending the throne? Well, that all depends according to you as a viewer. You actively have the opportunity that could alter the future of France. In this said particular place, one might find the true Count of Monte Cristo. Thank you.